Hi everybody, welcome to this Timeline documentary. My name is Dan Snow and here I am in a Lancaster bomber cockpit, one of the few remaining Lancasters from the Second World War, to tell you about my new history channel. It's called History Hit. It's like Netflix for history. Hundreds of history documentaries on there and interviews with many of the world's best historians. Follow the information below this film or just search online for History Hit and make sure you use the code TIMELINE to get a special introductory offer. Now enjoy this show.
We're already just about at the limits of survival, and going beyond is real catastrophe, and it's a very serious matter. The Republican Party in the United States is dedicated to destroying the species. Somebody should say that in those words, because it's true.
The remnants of democracy is but a facade. A two-party system creates an illusion of choice, but all too often, neither party has peace, equality, and freedom as their ultimate goal. It seems this is just a ploy to get people to support their wars. Nevertheless, such support is not universal, and the march to war and injustice is not without opposition. In 1967, Students for Democratic Society formed in opposition to the Vietnam War. A fraction of the group became known as the Weathermen. It took 2 years until their frustration with seemingly useless protests escalated to the level where they resorted to bombs as a radical means to end the injustice of war.
Weathermen is an enormously significant group, but that's not to say it was a success. In almost every way, shape, or form that you look at Weathermen, it was an abject failure.
The two simple goals we had: end the war in Vietnam and end racism in the United States. As many people as we mobilized, as many people as we convinced, as much as we did, as much as we tried, we failed at both. We did not end the war in Vietnam.
If you're, the type that wants to occupy a building, Weathermen is the type and the group of people that you're going to look back at. And I think not just to learn what they did right, but to learn the lessons of what they did wrong.
If you ask an American person or an American teacher, do you think Germany should teach World War II and teach the horrible things that went on? Should it teach the number of people who were murdered and killed during that war? And the answer is, of course they should. Then you say, do you think the United States should teach the history of the genocide against Native Americans? Should we teach how many people were killed in Vietnam? Should we teach how many people were displaced and killed in Iraq? The answer is no, we shouldn't. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? How are you?
All right.
Have a good day.
This fall, in Chicago, we will lead massive demonstrations against the war in support of the Black Panther Party and in solidarity with all political prisoners.
Bill Ayers grew up in Illinois. He was the son of relatively wealthy parents, was a student in Michigan in the 1960s, was involved in civil disobedience against the draft in 1965, and he describes that as a moment of his, radicalization. He was deeply committed to backing up his values and his words with action and became more militant over the course of the 1960s. He, as a leader of the Weather Underground. And if you look at some of his rhetoric from the most radical phases of the Weatherman's history, it's, quite extreme, and then became, newly notorious when he published his memoir, which was really the first big memoir of former Weather Underground members. And then I believe it was released on September 11th. That was the official publication date of, 2001. On September 12th, the New York Times ran a story about the book where he's pictured stomping on an American flag, and he became demonized.
But you're surely right. If 50 years ago we said, and we did say, the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth, today we would say the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. I think that the world is swirling and dynamic and changing. It's sometimes hard to see because, 70 years is a long time in the life of a person, but not so long in the life of a struggle.
And things are terrible for most people in the world today. On the other hand, I think it's wrong to say that nothing's changed. The world is always changing. So we have to recognize that it will take different forms, but that many of the things that we take for granted today are because of struggles that came before us.
While I've written the books, the inspiration and the brains behind the whole outfit has been my partner of 44 years, Bernardine Dohrn.
That was a very good.
Quiero decirlo que a pesar de todos los libros que lleva escritos, la que la inspiración y la fuente de motivación de todos ellos es su compañera.
We live here in America, see, we're born here in this country too, and the notion that we're outlaws has got to be put together with the fact that America created us.
One of the leaders was Bill Ayers' future wife, Bernardine Dohrn. Other women joined the group in support of these goals. Kathy Wilkerson was one of them. Eventually, her story became the most iconic. After their small bomb factory blew up an entire 4-story building in the middle of Manhattan, killing 3 of their own, all members of the group were forced to vanish underground.
It's impossible to understand what happened to Weathermen without understanding the context of what was going on in those months in 1968, 1969. A lot of people in the movement began to say peaceful demonstration is just not going to create the type of change that we want. We have to start taking things to the next level. That was what you heard over and over. We have to take things to the next level.
Days of Rage had already taken that turn towards we're going to fight you, and that the point of it was to show how tough we were and how militant we were.
They had proven to themselves the depth of their commitment to militant and confrontational action. And in a weird way, it advanced their vision of turning more and more into a violent, revolutionary youth force capable of waging something like guerrilla war in the United States.
The demonstrations began as nonviolent activism. But what if the students had been heard? What if their message had been understood? Maybe such violence could have been avoided.
When we draw districts to exclude 89 million people to render them irrelevant because they happen to be minorities in safe seats across the country, that's not democracy. When we suppress the free and equal opportunity of people to vote based on the color of their skin or the party they happen to be in, that is not democracy. No! We have got to fight to get this ideal at the core of our democracy, again, the ideal of equality.
I'm here because I feel like we have a breakthrough moment in American politics where we actually might be able to effect some change because we actually have legislation in place that could change some things about getting money out of politics, and we need ordinary people to rise up. And like, I'm at the perfect stage of my life. You know, my kids are grown. I just like ready to do something.
I'm here because democracy, real democracy, was taught to Ben Franklin by the Iroquois nation. 65 years old, never been involved before, and it's time for me to stand up before I go to the other world.
Democracy is for the working class, because democracy is the only thing that the working class can hold on to prevent the rich from taking their lives.
Democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like.
Democracy Spring in April 2016 was meant to be a powerful but non-violent demonstration, in the same way as Occupy Wall Street a few years before. But mainstream media completely ignored the demonstration, even though 2,000 people were arrested at the Capitol. What is not in the news is not happening.
The words unprecedented have been used by the Capitol Police to describe what took place today. Hundreds of people have gotten themselves arrested in order to raise awareness about the issue of money in politics.
One person, one vote! One person, one vote! One person, one vote!
Now, well, the hashtag Democracy Spring has been trending on social media in the US, and some are also using the hashtag Media Blackout to express their frustration with how little coverage the story is getting in the mainstream media.
Where is CNN? Where is CNN? Where is CNN?
If violent revolution isn't effective, and peaceful activism is easily ignored, what is the best way for common people to have their voices heard?
It's a bleak time for working people in this country, and jobs are disappearing. And it's not just because of globalization. Jobs are disappearing because the relentless logic of capitalism is to, the ideal from the capitalist point of view is lots of production, no workers. And so that's what we're striving toward. Americans are very thrilled to have low prices on goods, but that all comes out of the backs of somebody. And so the warehouses that Amazon runs are run like plantations. What we have to do is change our paradigm. We have to talk about work, meaningful work that people can do, not wage slavery, not jobs, but work. And there's an infinite amount of work to do, to fix the infrastructure, to take care of the elderly, to take care of our neighbors, to grow the food locally, to take care of children. All of this is important work. The fact that it can't be monetized for a profit is what prevents us from organizing ourselves to do that work.
Money, 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 all I ever hear these days. Every song that the DJ plays, talking of a similar situation. Ain't got none and got to get some. Gotta have more than I had before. Gotta have more than the man next door. Every day I gotta make some more, some more, some more. Do I live to work or do I work to live? And do I give to earn or do I earn to give? And if I do my best for society, will it care about money or will it care about me? Do I live to work or do I work to live? And do I give to earn or do I earn to give? And if I do my best for society, will it care about money or will it care about? He works early in the morning till way past dark, and the people in power say that he's doing his part. If he works real hard, might make it to the top, but we all know that's not true. So stop talking this bullshit and face facts. Almost all the money owned by the fat cats. Well, they're telling lies to justify war. They're making all their money selling guns to the poor.
In short, we have the capacity to rebuild our whole planet, filling it with luxury, or we are capable of destroying it totally. The shocking issue of our age is that no one can confidently say which we will do.
If you listen to the rhetoric on Martin Luther King Day, it ends with the I Have a Dream speech in Washington in 1963. King didn't stop at that point. He went on. He tried to organize a movement on class lines, poor people's movement. In fact, he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, when he was supporting a public service worker strike, garbage worker strike, planning a march on Washington to establish a poor people's movement. He was, as soon as he moved the civil rights movement from racist sheriffs in Alabama to racism in the North and structural aspects of the society, he was dismissed, attacked, denigrated, and this part of his life is pretty much wiped out of history.
I believe that I'm going to do my job, and I believe that I was born not to die in a car wreck. I don't believe I'm going to die in a car wreck. I don't believe I'm going to die from sitting on a piece of ice. I don't believe I'm going to die because I got a bad heart. I don't believe I'm going to die because of lung cancer. I believe that I'm going to be able to die what I was just the thing that I was born for. I believe that I'm going to be able to die high off the people. I believe that I will be able to die as a revolutionary in the international revolutionary protest struggle. To yell for the people. Why don't you struggle for the people? Why don't you die for the people?
We understood that they would be the first to go because they were the young black organization, and very scary to a government that wanted to keep the lid on. In the fall of '69, Fred Hampton was assassinated in his bed. He was the leader of the Chicago Black Panther Party. He was 21 years old, I think. Very charismatic, high energy, hard worker. And a lovely person.
So a lot of the Weathermen worked with the Panthers in Chicago. They knew Fred Hampton personally or had seen him at demonstrations. They were deeply admiring of him. And then on December 4th of 1969, he was assassinated essentially in cold blood by the FBI working in concert with local police.
It took years, 7 years in court, to prove that the murder of Fred Hampton was planned by the Chicago Police Department and the FBI.
It's worth remembering that as soon as he was murdered, the police and the FBI put on a full propaganda effort to show, and they had a reenactment on television of how the officers, just all they wanted to do was deliver a subpoena. They knocked on the door peacefully, and suddenly shots were coming at them, and a shootout ensued. And so everyone, all the media reported a shootout, not an assassination, not a planned murder, but a shootout. And we said, no, this is an assassination. And meanwhile, their propaganda, backed by all their money and all their power, was defining, the situation.
It made us just feel that we had to do some more dramatic moves. We thought of it as putting our bodies between the bullets of the police and black freedom fighters in solidarity.
That kind of crowded out everything else in my life. I mean, after that, because I was in Chicago at the time, and I found out about it at 5 o'clock in the morning, and it just kind of shut down all the other possibilities. It made me listen to people who've said that we needed essentially to form a clandestine army in the United States. And it was improbable, unrealistic, and kind of a crazy thing to say, but under the circumstances, it made sense to me and other people to feel like we had no choice.
And then for the Weathermen, especially in Chicago, this was absolutely devastating. Essentially was an act of war against progressive and revolutionary forces, and they became more and more determined to fight fire with fire and step up their plans to take up arms against the American state.
The Black freedom struggle, which was also, entered a phase in the 60s. It was quite militant, quite strong. And what Malcolm X described was, described the situation of African Americans as the situation of a colonized people, a people that were held in bondage very much as an external colony might be held in bondage. But in this case, it was an internal colony. We supported it, and we argued that the role of white people, the role of white Americans, just like our role vis-a-vis the Vietnam War, was to find ourselves in alliance with the Vietnamese, in alliance with the Black struggle for self-determination, not just for an end to the war, but for the right to determine their own future. The interesting thing about that is the current struggle, the current phase of the African American struggle is once again defining the struggle as a colonial struggle, an anti-colonial struggle against an occupying police force. This is decided by an imperial headquarters, not by the people themselves.
Top of the morning, no, it's not a new day, but it's time to wake up, yes, it's time to wake up. Did you ever wonder about the world and the way we live? Oh, the pieces of the puzzle, they don't seem to fit. The play seems okay cause the actors are paid. Pull the curtain away and reveal the real stage. 1 in every 7 people on the planet doesn't have enough to eat, but somehow we just choose not to see. Try to keep it in perspective, saving all the unprotected. Still the people are neglected, we are all connected. Said, hey, you were free since the day that you came. Won't you take over the world today? You can be anything that you wanna be. Oh, oh, I said, hey, you were free since the day that you came. Won't you take over the world today? You can do anything that you wanna do. Oh, oh, but I can see the sunshine. The sunshine. I can see the sunshine. The sunshine. I can see the sunshine.
Between Christmas and New Year's, 1969 into 1970, they held what they called the War Council, sometimes the Wargasm, in a ghetto in Flint, Michigan. A celebration of everything that was Weathermen. A lot of drugs, a lot of group sex, violent speeches with, I guess the most infamous one would be when Bernardine Dohrn got up and recalled that this was just a matter of months after the Charles Manson massacre in L.A., and she talked about how one of Manson's acolytes has shoved a fork into the belly of the pregnant actress Sharon Tate as she was murdered. She famously said, put a fork in her, wild. And what happened immediately afterwards was far less known and far more secretive. As the leadership, about a dozen people came together and began actually making plans for what Weathermen was going to do.
We knew that the FBI was opening our mail and following us, and we began to understand that they were putting infiltrators in our organization. We began to feel like it was 1938 in Germany, and we needed to make preparations to survive if the FBI and the police and the government really clamped down on people.
And we splintered in reaction to a tremendous wave of repression, a tremendous sense that we had tried what we knew how to do, what was within our capacity to do, and it had failed. A deep sense of failure, betrayal, and uncertainty. So that was the mood at Flint, was a sense of how do we move forward? What can we do? And it was out of that that the Weather Underground emerged.
Flint was horrible, and I didn't really get it then, and I still don't really get it now. It just was a lot of graphics of guns and weapons, and really was a conference that came out of despair, I think.
For 45 years, Bill Ayers and a number of Weathermen alumni have preached the idea that Weathermen never intended to hurt a soul. That's what Weathermen ultimately became. That's not at all what it was in early 1970.
The months after Flint, as you say, were very important, where they tried to deepen their commitment to revolution, turn from being an above-ground organization to at least a semi-underground organization that would engage in some version of guerrilla war. And then some members of the collective in New York, and possibly some members of the organization elsewhere, hatched this plot to bomb a dance of non-commissioned officers in Fort Dix, New Jersey. A military installation close to New York City, a dance, an opportunity to do an extraordinary amount of damage, including killing military personnel and potentially, the ladies that they had brought with them and other staff at the party.
California had done their first action, the Midwest had done their first action, and it became time for New York to do its first action. And its first action ended up being the townhouse. The group that was tasked with carrying out the violent actions, the bombings, the whatever the heck was going to happen, was led by a young man from Kent State, a university in Ohio, named Terry Robbins, a very intense would-be poet who, in retrospect, many have said had violence in his own life, that he beat his girlfriend, that he had his own troubles.
He wanted to help the world. He wanted to make things better. But he was also angry, and the anger overwhelmed the love at a certain point for him, and I think for many of us. And frankly, I think it's a tricky balance for most people. I mean, most committed people, it's a tricky balance. I often say to students, if you're not pissed off, you're not paying attention. You should be angry. There should be days of rage. But if you're only pissed off, you'll never get to where you want to go. You'll never accomplish, you'll never achieve a better world if you're only angry.
I mean, the townhouse happened because it was all very badly thought out and thought through. And I think there was a lot of disagreement and, for one thing, we had no technical knowledge.
Unfortunately, as it turns out, Terry was a much more talented poet and orator than he was bomb builder. That morning, just before noon, Terry was down in the sub-basement of the townhouse with another young woman, Diana Oughton, building the bombs when one of them went off in his hands. Kathy Wilkerson was one of three other people in the house at that point.
At the moment that the explosion happened, I was ironing sheets right above where the floor above the basement. There was just this huge blast, the room filled with smoke, the floor sank, and I was holding the iron, and I thought, I don't want to put this down, it'll start a fire. And then I looked over 20 feet next to me and saw that the entire basement was engulfed in flame.
Terry and Diana Oughton were killed instantly. Only fragments of their bodies were ever found.
And I called out, and Kathy Bernardine was there. She responded, and I went and I found her through the rubble, and we went out through a hole. The whole front of the house had collapsed, so we just went towards the daylight.
Kathy Bernardine, the fourth member, was naked up in a shower, and another young man named Teddy Gold had just walked up from the basement when the first of the bombs went off.
And we didn't know that Teddy Gold was in the house. We had thought he had left to go buy something, and he must have just hesitated to tie his shoe or do something. We didn't know that he was still in the house. We didn't find out till a couple of days later when they found his body.
And even as fire engines and police car sirens filled the air, they then ran and disappeared into the subway and went underground, and neither one of them was captured for years.
We had a very complicated set of ways of staying in touch with each other. Phone calls set up, one payphone to another payphone, and I found out about it by picking up a payphone at a designated time.
And at some level, the story of what happened in the townhouse, is buried with the three people who, died there. And then Kathy Wilkerson and Kathy Boudin will say only a limited amount about, what was going on. So there's something, sort of absurd about that scenario. These guys in the basement plotting to commit what would be one of the most serious acts of terrorism in the entire history of the United States, while some woman upstairs is, changing the bed sheets. And I think it speaks to, the ideological confusion of the Weathermen, who sort of had one foot in kind of the normal world and another foot in the world of being like a stone-cold revolutionary, committing to doing things that would certainly change their lives forever and, at least in the short term, potentially alter the course of American history.
Do we need bomb factories and massive, violent revolution to get rid of those on top of the food chain who are systematically destroying our planet? Martin Luther King is known as one of the founders of nonviolent revolution. Malcolm X fought against his ideals, saying that nonviolence will never work against violent governments. Is it true that only through violence we are able to create a new system? Do we really have to be ready to die for our cause?
If you can't find a path forward, if the normal pathways toward social change or political change, if those normal pathways are blocked, then people begin to say, well, what else can we do to stop this crime? And then you begin, say, the crime of slavery, or the crime of genocide in Vietnam, or the crime of continuing the afterlife of slavery, which continues to this day. How can we stop it?
An entire movement that had really been riding on a tide of violent rhetoric was kind of shocked by what had happened. People had actually died, kids like them. And I think the townhouse, along with several other events that occurred in 1970, did more to prevent the spread of further political violence.
The FBI was absolutely terrified and determined to shut down the Weathermen. So the Weathermen needed to rapidly activate their plan to go underground. And then in the course of a very short amount of time,
we came out of that a single organization. We went into that quite a divided and splintered organization. We maintain the right to survive. We maintain the right to take the war to the war makers, and we will not harm or injure or kill people.
In the end, the townhouse did that. It definitely caught everybody's attention and has become an iconic event, but only because it was us that died and not because the actual actions were successful. And that's the great irony of it all.
No longer would they build bombs in an effort to kill policemen or military officers. From that point, they needed, in Bernardine's words, to be more life-affirming.
And for the next 11 years, we survived on the run from the FBI. Bernardine, as you know, was put on the 10 most wanted list. And the only time that J. Edgar Hoover and I ever agreed is when he called her the most dangerous woman in America. I agree with that. Still, actually.
You know, we used the language of war all the time in those days, meaning Revolutionary War, and I have lots of conflicting feelings about that metaphor now. But at the time, for us, liberation wars meant freedom from empire, and that's what we thought we were doing internally.
I was underground for 10 years, and But the Weather Underground only lasted for 4.5 or 5 years more.
We changed our identities. We changed our appearances slightly. And we issued statements saying we weren't going to participate openly in the political world anymore. We were going to participate as people who were fugitives from the law. And that's what it meant to be underground.
With the underground and the mass movement responding together, we could shut down every international airport in America within 24 hours.
And so for the next 6-7 years, that's what Weathermen was. It was a group that lived and worked underground, that exploded bombs, but never again did Weathermen injure anyone seriously, much less kill anyone.
At 1 minute before 1 o'clock this morning, the switchboard at the Capitol received a phone call. A man's voice said a bomb would go off in the building in half an hour. At 1:30 in the morning, it did.
In the years 1970 to 1973, there were something like 20,000 bombings against U.S. military installations inside the United States. We took credit for 24. So we were obviously fish swimming in a sea, weren't we? Not just fish swimming in a sea of America, but we were even in a sea of people who were furious about the war and willing to take matters into their own hands. We were a small fish in that sea too. We did much more than we took credit for, but we didn't do 20,000. Wouldn't have been capable of anything like that. And we were very clear that we weren't trying to hurt anybody, weren't trying to terrorize or intimidate anybody. We were trying to issue a screaming reply to the fact that 6,000 people a week were being murdered by our government. 6,000 a week with no end in sight. So you think about the World Trade Center and you think about, 9/11, and there were several thousand people killed in an act of inhumane terrorism against a population, against civilians, against innocent people. And then you think about the genocide, the attempted genocide in Vietnam, 6,000 people every week.
But as the 70s wore on, their numbers began to dwindle. A group that began with probably 400 people at Flint, perhaps 125 went underground. By 1971, 1972, had all but been forgotten.
I was not interested in going to trial. I pled guilty, essentially to possession of explosives. I was sentenced for what they call in New York 0 to 3, meaning the parole board can decide when you get out after a year. There are still a couple dozen political prisoners from the Black Panther Party in prison in the United States who've been in prison for 40 years. They had life at the end of their sentence. They had like 20 to life or something. So the parole board can keep them till they die. And they are one by one dying in prison.
Ultimately, Weathermen went out with a whimper and no more bangs. But it's amazing, the last remnants of Weathermen, Bernardine, Dohrn, and Bill Ayers, didn't turn themselves in till the end of 1980.
Bernardine Dohrn, the former anti-war leader and student radical, surrendered today in Chicago.
Rebellion is inevitable and continuous. Resistance by every means necessary is happening and will continue to happen within the United States as well as around the world. And I remain committed to the struggle ahead.
This, I think, is one of the things that's happened during the course of this campaign, that there's a set of assertions made by Senator Clinton as well as her husband that are not factually accurate. I think that part of what the people are looking for right now is somebody who's going to solve problems and not resort to the same typical politics that we've seen in Washington. That is something that I hear all across the country.
This young man from Illinois was running for president, Barack Obama, and he was obviously very bright, very accomplished, very charismatic, very brilliant. smartest guy in any room he walked into. And so Hillary Clinton came up with this idea. And the way it burst into the public scene was that during a debate between Clinton and Obama, George Stephanopoulos, who was a close friend of the Clintons, well, what about this other friend of yours, Bill Ayers? He bombed the Pentagon, and he's never said he was sorry, and what about that? And Obama said something like, he's a guy around the neighborhood. I don't share political discussions with him. I knew him, and he tried to brush it off.
And the notion that somehow, as a consequence of me knowing somebody who engaged in detestable acts 40 years ago when I was 8 years old, somehow reflects on me and my values doesn't make much sense, George.
It happened that my graduate students were in my living room the night of the debate. We were having a seminar, and we were just cleaning up, and somebody put on the debate just at the point that came on. My students fell on the floor. They were completely stunned. And one of my students turned to me and said, "That guy has the same name as you." And somebody else said, "That's because it is him." And she couldn't believe it.
One of his earliest supporters is a man who, according to the New York Times, was a domestic terrorist and part of a group that, quote, launched a campaign of bombings that would target the Pentagon and the U.S. Capitol.
The fact is that while it was uncomfortable and while it was difficult in certain ways, the fact is it didn't really hurt me very much at all. I mean, it wasn't pleasant, it wasn't fun to be in the kind of, but if anyone was prepared for it in a funny way, I was, for a couple of reasons. One is because I was old enough to know that they couldn't define me for myself. I know who I am. I don't have to be loved by CBS News.
Barack Obama and domestic terrorist Bill Ayers, friends. They've worked together for years, but Obama tries to hide it. Why? We know Bill Ayers ran the violent left-wing activist group called Weather Underground. We know Ayers' wife was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. But Obama's friendship with terrorist Ayers isn't the issue. The issue is Barack Obama's judgment and candor. Barack Obama, too risky for America.
I'm John McCain, and I approve this message.
We got a lot of death threats. We had a lot of, we got a call from our alderman at one point. She was worried about me because she'd gotten a lot of threats, and so they parked a cop car out in front of our house. The university had a cop assigned to me, and his name, ironically, was Officer Muhammad. And Officer Muhammad would check in on me every day and follow me home sometimes. And I had sent him 2 death threats that I'd gotten on my computer. One from a guy in Texas who said he was coming to Chicago with a posse to assassinate me, and they had my home address written down. And the other guy said he was coming, another guy from, I believe, Georgia, said that he and a group were coming to kidnap me and waterboard me. And Muhammad took a look at the 2 emails and he said, "Gee, Bill, I hope the guy who's going to shoot you gets here first, because it would be horrible to be waterboarded and then shot. Better to be shot and avoid the waterboarding." And I agreed.
If you have to ask me, I'll tell you what is wrong. There's no real freedom, that's something you should know. You mean nothing at all to the owners of the world. They manipulate you, they'll bring you to your knees. For your life is worthless and they'll do as they please. You mean nothing at all to the owners of the world. Tell me, where are your rights? Tell me, when will you realize that we live in a
most superficial thing in the world is celebrity and popularity, and equally ridiculous is unpopularity. So none of that matters. And I think that we live in a culture where celebrity has trumped accomplishment on 1,000 levels, and that's a mistake.
So the Weathermen had convinced themselves that revolution by means of armed struggle was desirable, necessary, and possible. But they had no real theory of how to gain state power. Okay, what it would mean to overthrow the United States. Do you occupy the Capitol? Do you annul the Constitution? Do you essentially burn to the ground American institutions only to, reinvent them? They had no practical social vision of what it would mean to succeed in their goal of revolution. So there was nothing formally religious about their vision, but they had a kind of moral zeal about them and belief that positive change could come through some kind of apocalyptic conflict with the powers that be.
Did we make mistakes? We made terrible mistakes. Am I devastated by all the people that were killed? Yes. But I feel like if I get up every day and I do the best I can and I'm as principled as I can be, that's kind of how I look back at the past. I'm glad that I'm a passionate person. I'm glad that I took risks to act on my principles.
We have no regrets for our political history, broadly defined, in the sense that we chose sides, and we think the side we chose was right, historically right, and that we tried to act with a conscience and do minimal harm to human beings, or no harm to human beings. But I think that, of course, we have many regrets toward our comrades, toward people we treated harshly.
About the only concrete legacy I could identify of Weathermen was the security systems that we all live with now. Bomb detectors and bomb-sniffing dogs put at the Capitol, put at police stations, put at government buildings. That all started because of Weathermen. The tightening of dynamite purchase laws, that all started because of Weathermen. I think the nicest thing that you can say about them is in their fervency and their commitment, they have remained an inspiration to those like-minded people, many of them young, who are on the radical left today. Those you see in the Occupy Wall Street movement, I think, would be first among them. They can still draw inspiration from the incredible commitment of Weathermen without endorsing their actions, their political violence.
There's some evidence, not certain, but some, that in 1969, Richard Nixon, then president, was contemplating using nuclear weapons to end the war forever, and that he was deterred by mass mobilizations that were taking place here. Can't prove it, but it looks pretty much like that. And it continues. It's true that it didn't end the war, but it did have an impact. A couple of years later, when Ronald Reagan became president, his administration attempted to duplicate in Central America exactly what Kennedy had done in South Vietnam 20 years earlier. So they followed almost the same steps. White paper about how the communists are taking over the world and so on and so forth. There was such a backlash that they backed off.
After the election in November 2016, people were marching in the streets in every major city. But is the marching enough? We easily forget the past, not always realizing that we're seeing a repeat of what our parents and grandparents did in their time. For us, this feels very new, but it's not. It's a pattern and puts us on a leash.
We're at a point where we can either save the earth and end capitalism, or we can save capitalism and end the earth. And it seems to me that's the stark choice. Now, what will the future look like? No one can predict. But there's no question that as a system that's based on predation, that's based on theft, that's based on constant expansion, that system will kill us all. And so we must find a way to fight for more peace, more participation, more transparency, more democracy, and more sustainability. If we can't find that path, we are doomed. And that's an urgent call for all of us.
Yeah. Mother Earth.
Radical means going to the root. Radical means finding out what's underneath. So a typical liberal would say, this war is bad. A typical radical would say, why do we have war? So the classic kind of biblical type story is the villagers are tending to the fields, and a river is running near the village, and somebody sees a baby floating in a basket, and they rush out to save the baby, and they bring the baby in, and they say, let's take care of the baby, and they feed the baby and find a place for it to live, and so on. And 2 days later, they're working in the fields, and 4 babies come down in baskets, and they rush into the river, and they save the babies, and they give them food and find a place for them to stay. A week later, 20 babies come floating down the river, and they rush into the river. And somebody says, maybe we should go upriver and find out why the babies are coming into the river. And everybody says, no, it's a crisis. We have to save the babies. The radical is the one who says, let's find out why the babies are coming in the river. And the liberal is the one who wants to save the baby. The radical wants to save the baby too, but the radical wants to stop the flow of babies. So that's how I use the word radical. I know in today's mass media, radical means something about religion and something about fundamentalism and something about making bombs. That's not the meaning of radical. Radical means going to the root of things.
The system created us. It was powered by the victories of World War II, and it was delivered to us as a desirable lifestyle through public relations, marketing, advertisements, music and film industry, the World Wide Web, Facebook, and Google. Our system made us consumers, keeping our eyes shut with lies while they tested atomic bombs and destroyed life in the Pacific, created wars over oil, and created terrorism to keep us fearful and under control. This system created drug wars, man-made viruses, pharmaceutical profiteering, Monsanto-based food industry, homeless, angry, and poor people throughout the world, from Midland America to South America to India. And it created President Donald Trump. The system that chooses profit over people has been destroying our planet over the past 100 years, and we have let that happen. We were too busy watching Friends, Seinfeld, Sex and the City, and the Kardashians on TV, wasting our time with Hollywood movies, Netflix, and multiple news channels, that we didn't pay attention to what they were doing. They poison our minds with their financial propaganda, poison our intestines with profitable pesticides. And now they're planning to take away our water, the only thing that is still free other than air. If we continue keeping our eyes and minds closed, they will take our air as well, because they can. They made the system so their crimes are legal.
The threat of war is, in fact, increasing. Nuclear war, that's recognized in pretty high places. Recently, William Perry, former defense secretary, one of the most respected analysts and students of nuclear affairs, warned that the threat of war now is greater than it was during the Cold War. The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists every year since, I think, 1947 has what they call a doomsday clock, where they set the time certain distance from midnight. Midnight means termination. We destroy ourselves. They just moved it 2 minutes closer to midnight, so 3 minutes from midnight.
The more I find myself believing, the more I know I can be sure. If words have more than just one meaning,